As we move forward, we want to turn to another election. Well, aftermath of the election, that's the inauguration of Claudia Sheinbaum as the new president of Mexico. That happened on Tuesday, I believe it was. I'm sorry, losing track of my days here, but maybe it was yesterday. Anyway, it happened this week. I'm obviously struggling. I'm a little bit under the weather, but thankfully, I will be corrected on all important points by Kirk Hackbarth, who is a writer and a journalist for Jacobin Magazine and the host of the Soberanía Mexican Politics podcast. Kurt, thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be back with you guys. Thanks very much. And yes, it was Tuesday, October 1st.
Thankfully. Okay, I'm not going crazy. That's good to know. Kurt, I want to start here. I was looking at some of what took place during the context of the inauguration, and one of the moments that I thought was poignant was the traditional ceremony, the handing over of the baton, so to speak, from the indigenous community to Claudia Sheinbaum. The ceremony they performed around her. I mean, talk about the importance of that in the context of the politics of the fourth transformation. I think a lot of people know there's a big indigenous population in Mexico, but to me it feels very notable to have seen that open of a display in the context of a presidential inauguration.
Yeah, that is very symbolically important, as you mentioned. So it was a big day on Tuesday. Claudia Sheinbaum began her day in the Congress, and that was the kind of the protocol where they had the official inauguration, and that was the passing of the presidential sash from the outgoing president López Obrador to Claudia Sheinbaum. And it was actually very touching to see that both of their cars on the way to Congress were mobbed by people. Just mobbed by people who wanted to say goodbye to López Obrador. You know, he's leaving office with a 70+% approval rating, and also say, pues, hello and welcome to the incoming president, of course, Mexico's first woman president. So she gave a very good speech in Congress, but it doesn't end there. As you very rightly pointed out, she then went to the public square, the Zócalo. And, it's really interesting in Mexico. When there's an event like this, the entire downtown closes down. I mean, it really becomes like a popular festival with dance, with different events going on, with people dancing on street corners. I mean, it really is, it's this idea of mass politics that I think we've really lost in the global north, right? At least within parties, right? So when Claudia Sheinbaum arrived, there was this traditional indigenous ceremony of what's called bestowing her with the baston de mando, which I guess we can roughly translate in English as the staff of command. And this is a symbol that is given in indigenous communities throughout Mexico. It gives political and spiritual authority to the leader, to then be able to take command, not absolute command. Indigenous communities work on what's called an usos y costumbres system, which is roughly like a town hall or an assembly system. But the baston de mando is what gives you the authority to speak, to preside, to kind of become the voice of the community. And that was a very powerful moment. López Obrador had also had a traditional ceremony when he took office in 2018. And then after that, Claudia Sheinbaum laid out a very detailed 100-point plan, right, which maybe we can talk about in a moment. All of this is coming in the context of a constitutional amendment which just gave indigenous and Afro-Mexican communities greater autonomy, greater legal autonomy. That was just passed days ago and ratified. So that makes indigenous communities more empowered to make decisions, to have their traditional forms of government legally recognized, and to be able to fend off multinational mining and other water projects that have in previous administrations been able to walk in and do whatever they wanted. In most parts of the country.
Well, you mentioned that 100-point plan, and I guess I'm just curious when it comes to Claudia Sheinbaum. She is an ally of AMLO, who has been all about nationalizing resources, and he's managed to do some of that. Obviously, a very progressive leader of a very progressive party in Mexico that took back power after much right-wing rule in Mexico, and has also been attacked by the U.S. government, by sitting members in the U.S. government. Mostly Republicans, but also hasn't had very kind words from Democrats in the entire U.S. mainstream media. I'm curious if Claudia has the same policies as AMLO and is seen in a similar way as like a threat to the sorts of people who hate AMLO, the way that someone like Lindsey Graham might. I mean, just last year, Lindsey Graham was threatening to bomb Mexico, which I still just can't get over. But, he is a very important figure in the Senate. He's not a nobody.
Right, and he's not the only one.
Mm.
The short answer to the question is yes. Claudia Sheinbaum has promised that there's going to be continuity with what she called the first floor of the fourth transformation, and that she wants to do the second floor of the fourth transformation. There were a lot of voices during the campaign that attempted to goad her into creating kind of a rupture with AMLO and saying, "Oh, you have to, create your own brand and be your own person, whatever else." And she, pointed out, I'm part of a movement, right? Just like what we talked about with the staff of command right now. This is a movement behind me. So when she took her oath of office, she said, "I'm not just coming as a single woman, I'm coming for all Mexican women." And she really gave kind of a very moving rundown of, our great grandmothers who couldn't, learn to read and write because schools weren't for them. Right? Our aunts who, found their strength in silence. My generation, which went through the emancipation of women, and then our daughters, our granddaughters. Now, that could very easily just stay on kind of the shallow level of kind of bourgeois liberal discourse, as it often does in the United States. So it's very important that she was talking about how women have come to power through struggles in the workplace, through popular movements in the streets. So she linked the idea of this fourth transformation to a transformation of women, but not just as a kind of a facade idea. With regards to her program, part of it is giving continuity to what's already there. So that means the social programs that are in place will continue. A lot of them will be extended. For example, AMLO instituted a universal pension, 65 and over. That's going to be reduced to 60 for women, because as we know, as women in a lot of cases, because of caregiving and caring for adults or children, other things, haven't had a chance to build up a kind of a retirement retirement system. So that's important. The scholarship system that AMLO set up is now going to be extended to all students, right? Primary, secondary, and high school. So in that sense, there's going to be an extension of what was already there. But there's also going to be Scheinbaum's own emphasis on this. Now, she's a physicist, she's a climate scientist, she's a climate engineer. So there's, first of all, there's much more of an accent on women's issues. There's going to be a new cabinet level position of women's affairs. She has proposed a constitutional amendment for gender parity, very similar to the ERA in the US that was never ratified. In Mexico, this is very likely going to be ratified with the supermajority that Morena has. Issues in that vein, but also environmental issues. That's her specialty. But not through kind of a private sector greenwashing model, but harnessing Mexico's public sector, which means Pemex, which means the Federal Electricity Commission, to build out an energy transition through the public infrastructure. So I think that's very important. She's also talked about making Mexico into a lever of development. Traditionally in Latin America, going back to colonial times, Latin America was simply an exporter of raw materials. And that's the way the global north wanted it to continue. Just export raw materials and cheap labor, and that's it. So what you have with Scheinbaum is an emphasis of, we have lithium, we're going to use it to develop our own lithium-based products. We want to have an electric car, right? We want to derive our lithium into our own products. We want to put a satellite into space. We want to focus on science. Right? We want to have our own software, build out our own software system. So not, depending on Elon Musk and, Zuckerberg and all these people. And this is the emphasis on sovereignty that is going to rankle the United States. The United States doesn't want Mexico to have its own electric car. They want Mexico to be dependent on American technology, American cars, American chips, American everything, and then just, export cheap labor and resources. That is going to be a fight. And that's going to, but anybody who thinks that Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be a pushover, they don't know her. Just days before the inauguration, she told the King of Spain, "Hey, you're not coming."
Yeah.
Because, AMLO made a proposal, a very, I think, legitimate proposal back in 2019 that, Spain and Mexico could have a joint ceremony of asking for an apology to the indigenous peoples of Mexico for the atrocities of the conquest. They didn't even bother to answer, and then leaked the letter to the press, which led to this anti-AMLO pile-on over there in Spain. So, President-elect Sheinbaum said, how about you just not come? If you can't answer a letter. So I think that was kind of a foretelling of the fact that this is, she's going to be a force to reckon with here.
No, I think that's true. And I think in another area, it seemed true to me just looking at the invitations that went out for the inauguration and also who came. And that is sort of I wouldn't actually really call it neutralism of Mexico from the point of view of foreign policy, but an approach that looks towards collaboration as opposed to wars and confrontation on multiple levels. I mean, she invited Putin and Zelensky. She invited Xi. She invited Maduro. I mean, almost every world leader was invited. They didn't all come, but I thought it was notable, especially in the context of President Lula, who of course was there, President Petro, who of course was there, who have been also propounding similar themes in terms of how the United Nations should work, of how conflict should be brought to an end. And that seems like also an important factor in terms of not just Mexico's role, but sort of the multiplier effect of sort of a Latin American approach to the world arena that's pushing an agenda that I think looks very different than a lot of what we're hearing from the countries of the global north, especially.
I think that's absolutely right. In the first term of Morena, of López Obrador, you saw Mexico taking a regional leadership role, which it had basically given up during the neoliberal era. And so you saw López Obrador sending a plane to save Evo Morales after the coup in Bolivia in 2019, refusing to recognize Juan Guaido, right? Calling a spade with regard to Peru and saying this is a coup, right? And Mexico does not have diplomatic relations with Peru right now. Defending Mexican sovereignty when Noboa in Ecuador invaded the Mexican embassy, right? So really defending this idea of not only national sovereignty, but regional sovereignty, really going after the Organization of American States for being an appendage of Washington and trying to find, still in early stages, but a real lasting alternative to the OAS, something like CELAC, which is the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations. And what you just said as well, right? The United States was invited, but China was invited, but Russia was invited, right? Mexico does not have to be a U.S. vassal state and can have relationships with anyone and everyone, right? Because it's a sovereign nation, right? And I think we're going to see that continuing. And I think that's why the shot across the bow with Spain was symbolically important as well. Mexico is now the 12th largest world economy. It's actually overtaken Spain. And so this idea of treating Mexico and anywhere in the global south as just this kind of, colonial kind of approach, those days are over. Those days are over. We see the global south taking leadership roles in very important diplomatic and international situations right now, including the Middle East. And I think, Mexico it's without replicating the aggressive patterns of the global north is saying, now is the time to really understand that, we're in a new era here. Mexico is not about to join BRICS tomorrow, but, I wouldn't count out some interesting alliances coming down the road in coming years.
Since you brought up the Middle East, I'm just curious, obviously, like the biggest story around the world has been the genocide in Gaza and now Israel escalating its aggression in Lebanon, where I live, and then also the potential for all-out war in the Middle East that it could involve not just Iran and Israel, but Iran and the U.S., which is quite frightening. And I'm just curious how all that's been playing out amidst this shift in Mexico having their first woman president. I did see a few months back Claudia Sheinbaum getting some attention. I mean, that's her husband's name is Jesus. And so she thanked him when she won. She said she thanked her husband Jesus for his support. And all these pro-Israel people were like, see, she's not a real Jew because she's worn a keffiyeh before and had made pro-Palestine statements. So I guess, we do know that the issue of Israel across the Americas tends to be used by the right wing to attack people who are progressive. So I guess I'm just curious if that's played out at all in Mexico and how the situation in the Middle East is being discussed and talked about, or if it's even on a topic of concern among the Morena party, for example.
It is a topic of concern. I think it's important to recall that Israel has a terrible record in Latin America. It has a terrible record in Latin America of supporting, right-wing paramilitary groups, of being basically the U.S. proxy in the region throughout the 70s and 80s, whenever there was some kind of embargo that the United States, couldn't export arms, for example, there was, after Pinochet in Chile in the 70s, Israel stepped in and did all of that for the U.S., right? The history of Israel and Colombia is atrocious. The history of Israel and Guatemala is atrocious. They even talked openly in the times of Guatemala of kind of this Palestinization of the Maya people, right? Kind of using the Israel model to kind of ghettoize and genocide the Maya people at the time, right? So Israel has been active for decades in Latin America, providing arms, providing weapons, providing money, and providing what we call advising, the worst and most extreme groups in Latin America. All of this is to say that not to generalize, but the regional sense in Latin America is overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian. And that's very, very true in Mexico. Plus the mere fact of being post-colonial societies. They know what's going on. Did that play a major role in the presidential campaign? It didn't. Traditionally, foreign policy is not as big in presidential campaigns in Mexico as in the U.S. But at some point, President Sheinbaum is going to have to come out and take a stand on this. She's been rather circumspect so far. You pointed out very rightly that she's made some very important pro-Palestine and pro-Gaza statements in the past. I think she's very much in the vein of in the anti-Zionist tradition of Jewishness. But this is something that at some point we're gonna have to see. I think Mexico is has been leery of wading into this too far, right? And what we've seen is a greater leadership role in this being taken by Colombia and Brazil, right? So that's an open thing. As we see this expanding, where is Mexico going to be on this? I think that's a very important question.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fourth transformation continues, and as it unfolds, we'll get answers to some of these questions. Kurt, it's really always a pleasure to have you here. Hope everyone is following your Byline and Jacobin magazine and also the Soberanía podcast. Great stuff, both places, both the written and the spoken word. Kurt Hackbarth, writer and journalist, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure.